Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome back all of you to our lecture program, our members, and those who are not members yet, and we hope to have you attending our future lectures. First, I would like to announce our next lecture. Our next lecture is going to be held on Sunday, November 15 at 2 p.m. Chicago time. Our lecturer is going to be Dr. Miranda Xafa. She is a former member of the International Monetary Fund's Executive Board. The title of her lecture is Greece, Recovering from Two Debt Crises and a Pandemic. Dr. Xafa is going to join us from Athens, Greece, and because of the 8 hours time difference, we are going to move the time of the lecture from 3 p.m. to 2 p.m. to make it a little bit more convenient for Dr. Xafa. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Alexander Kitroeff, professor of history at Haverford College in Pennsylvania. He holds a PhD degree in modern history from Oxford University, and he is the author of a number of books. These books include The Greeks in Egypt, 1919-1937, Ethnicity and Class, Griegos and America, The Greeks in the Americas, Wrestling with the Ancients, Modern Greek Identity and the Olympics, Hellas, Europe, Panathinaikos, 100 χρόνια ελληνική ιστορία, The Greeks and the Making of Modern Egypt, and the title of his forthcoming book is Greek Orthodoxy in America, A Modern History. He has collaborated with film director Maria Iliou as historical advisor in several documentaries, including The Journey, The Greek Dream in America, Smyrna, 1922, The Destruction of a Cosmopolitan City, and Athens Between East and West, 1821 to 1896. This is a 5-part series, and the first part of it was premiered in Athens, Greece, last February. I would like to say a few words how this lecture is going to proceed. Professor Kitroeff first, he's going to introduce his subject by showing a number of pictures. Then we are going to switch in an interview format. I'm going to pose a number of questions to Professor Kitroeff, and he's going to develop his subject around these questions. We will close the lecture with a questions and answer session. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. In order to ask a question, please click on this button. A screen is going to open on the left of your screen, and then there you can type your question. Professor Kitroeff will be able to see the questions, and he is going to respond to them. For those who attend on Facebook, because Professor Kitroeff is on the Zoom screen, he will not be able to see your questions. Stefanos Sakelaridis, who is going to attend the event on both Zoom and Facebook, he is going to communicate your questions on Facebook to Professor Kitroeff. Finally, I would like to point out that this lecture is supported by the Hellenic Foundation Chicago, and we greatly appreciate their support. Professor Kitroeff, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Costa. Thank you, Sava, for your generous introduction. And thank you to Hellenic Link Midwest for the invitation. And thanks to all of you for taking time off from your Sunday afternoons to learn something about and share have a conversation about the Greeks in Egypt. As you know, the Greeks in Egypt were the most important Greek diaspora community for the first half of the 20th century. And of course, the Greek Americans became the most important in the second half of the 20th century. I am going to now share my screen and share with you a series of slides that are intended to take us through the trajectory of the Greek presence in Egypt to enable our conversation that will follow. First of all, the Greeks in Egypt as a topic is a very personal story for me. My great-grandparents left Chios and Amorgos and moved to Alexandria in the late 19th century. Their names were Alexandros Kitroeff, who was born in Chios, and Polixeni Gavala, who was born in Amorgos. They settled in Egypt, where thousands of Greeks were settling because of the cotton boom in that country and its proximity to Greece. Alexandria had a huge Greek population. It was a cosmopolitan city. It had about 35 to 45,000 Greeks, depending on the time you're counting, thousands of Italians, Jews, and other Europeans, Belgium and French. In the 1920s, it's worth noting, especially to you, that Alexandria, Chicago, and Constantinople were the three cities with the largest Greek concentration outside Greece. That changed later on. We know, unfortunately, what happened to the Greeks in Constantinople. We know that the Greeks from Egypt started leaving because of the nationalist revolution in the 1950s. And here in the United States, New York, I think, eventually overtook Chicago demographically. But I know very well the history of the Greek Americans, and it's a special pleasure to be mentioning this historic community as in conjunction with the Greeks in Egypt. I grew up as a child learning about life in Egypt, the cosmopolitan Egypt, the nice things, the easy life, including the cosmopolitan atmosphere, which included spending time at Pastrudis patisserie, where the English writer E.M. Forster met the poet Constantine Cavafy, and they started a very fruitful relationship. I was the first who was born in Greece from my family. My great-grandparents emigrated there, as I said. My grandfather was born there, my father was born there, my grandmother was born there. I grew up in Greece hearing about how wonderful life was in Alexandria. Not only Pastrudis, but Stanley Beach as well, one of the cosmopolitan centers of Alexandria in the good old cosmopolitan era. My connection to Greece is also academic. I did my doctoral dissertation on the Greeks in Egypt, produced, Kostas mentioned it, this book, The Greeks in Egypt, 1919 to 1937, a monograph based on my dissertation. I moved to the United States and put the Greeks of Egypt aside in terms of research. But just a few years ago, the American University of Cairo Press contacted me and asked me to write an overview of the presence of the Greeks in Egypt from the beginning of the 19th through to the 1950s and the 1960s. And it was a pleasure. These books are divided exactly by 30 years. And that's a long time. And during that time, I had to catch up with what had been written about the Greeks in Egypt because a lot of scholarship had taken place. And the scholarship had to do with a discussion started by Athanasios Politis, who was the Greek general consul in Egypt. And Athanasios Politis talked about the contribution of the Greeks in Egypt. He called them the pioneers of civilization, iskapanis tou politismou, because they helped Egypt develop economically so significantly. The Greeks in Egypt helped development of both Egypt and Greece. And one of the most important families, and I will concentrate only on this family for the purposes of this talk, is of course the Benaki family, who intermarried with the Joremi family and the Salvago family. This is a wonderful photograph of the Joremis, and the Joremis on the left, the Salvagos on the right, in their garden in Ramli, which was the upper class neighborhood of Alexandria. The Benakis were so important that when Eleftherios Venizelos visited Alexandria in 1915, he was hosted by the Benakis, and this photograph shows Eleftherios Venizelos. And as we look at the photograph to the right is one of the Benaki daughters known as Penelope Delta. Penelope Delta, of course, I think is known to most of you, written young adult literature which focused on the Greek project of the great idea, spoke about the Macedonian struggle and the great idea with books that at least I grew up at school in Greece reading those books. Another contribution of the Benaki family, of course, is the Benaki Museum in Athens. Adonis Benakis, Penelope's brother, the son of Emmanuel Benakis, who was the Benaki patriarch, was a collector, and he moved his collection to Greece in the 1920s. And the Benaki Museum we know in Greece, which is on the corner of Vasilissis Sofias and Koubari, just below Kolonaki Square, was the old Benaki house donated to Greece as a museum. The main contribution of the Greeks was cotton. And it wasn't just the export of cotton. Many people have said, the Greeks were only exporting cotton, that helped England. Yes, it did, but it also helped Egypt. But the Greeks, because there were so many Greeks, also got involved in developing strands of cotton and helped Egyptian cotton keep up, because cotton is a very sensitive plant and there is soil exhaustion, and Greek agronomists continued to contribute by developing new strands and helping Egyptian cotton maintain its position on the world markets. The Greeks also were very important in the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. They not only with the initial digging, but then the administration. Most of the Greeks had come from the islands of Kassos and Castellorizo. They went south to Port Said. Port Said didn't exist. It was just a desert at the time. They lived in very difficult conditions, gained the appreciation of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French engineer who pioneered the idea of the canal. In fact, the story goes that as the canal was ready to be opened and the encampments of the workers were transforming into cities, the Greeks asked Ferdinand de Lesseps to name the city at the northern opening of the canal. They asked him to call it Nea Kassos. But appreciative as he was, Ferdinand de Lesseps said, I can't, we have, Said is the Khedive, Said is the king of Egypt, we have to name it after the king. Otherwise, Port Said would have been called Nea Kassos. Another area where the Greeks contributed, and what I'm showing here is a variety, a broad range of Greek contribution, was in the tobacco industry. Kyriazi Frères, or Kyriazi Brothers, is one of the many companies that developed tobaccos brought from Asia Minor and Macedonia, blended in Egypt, which made the Egyptian cigarette one of the most important luxury items in the first half of the 20th century. And it wasn't only the wealthy Greeks who contributed in export and manufacturing. Hundreds of Greeks spread throughout the country, opening smaller stores, especially the Greek bakal or bakalis, the grocer, was very well known. I think almost the Greek grocer in Egypt is the equivalent of the Greek-American diner owner of the present. Most foreigners didn't want to go south into the small cities, towns, but the Greeks were there.
Don't cut it, don't cut it, don't cut it.
Another contribution was through the philanthropical institutions that the Greeks established. This is the old Greek hospital in Alexandria. This is where Constantine Cavafy sought to care towards the end of his life, which came in 1933. But it's important to note that the Greek philanthropic institutions were open to destitute Egyptians and took care of them as well. They were not only for the Greeks. And in the Greek hospital of Alexandria, because of its technical expertise, a lot of medical innovations took place in the late 19th century, benefiting the whole country. I needn't say anything, I think, about the other contribution of the Greeks in Egypt. It was not only Cavafy, there was a whole community of literate Greeks who were interacting with Greek intellectuals, debating the pluses and minuses of having the Katharevousa or the Demotic language. And it was within the cosmopolitan environment of Alexandria that Cavafy lived, worked, and acquired an international reputation, which is very much alive for today. Finally, another connection that the Greeks in Egypt had with the home country was through religion, because the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate in Alexandria was one of the oldest Greek Orthodox patriarchates in the Eastern Mediterranean. And an example of how important the Patriarchate was, that one of its leaders in its leader in the 1920s through the 1930s was Meletios Metaxakis. Meletios Metaxakis is the prelate who established our Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America in 1922, 21, and then in 22 officially. He became ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. He was kicked out of Constantinople by the government there and became patriarch of Alexandria. So the ties of the Greeks were many. However, I talked about a debate taking place over the contributions. And because I was writing a book for the American University of Cairo Press, I had to take into account academic contributions. If you talk to the Greeks of Egypt, they'll all say, yes, of course we contributed. And of course they did. But some scholars say, look, yes, you contributed, but you had some special privileges. You had the capitulations, which protected you from local prosecution, from local taxation, from conscription, and searching of your domicile. You also had the support of the British, who took over. The British basically ran Egypt from 1882 through World War II. So what do you have to say, scholars would ask me, about the contribution? It was a contribution that was helped. My answer to that is yes, but my litmus test is that the Greeks continue to contribute to Egypt as well as Greece after those foreign privileges are taken away. So it wasn't just the foreign privileges that made them contribute, it was their deep connection that they had with the country because of the ancient ties of Greece and Egypt, through the religious ties and through the geographical connection. So the privileges start being taken away in 1937. It's a piecemeal process. The first thing is that the capitulations go in 1937. And yet, in the 1930s, where this was obvious that it was going to happen, Greeks invested in industry, in manufacture. This is Dimitri Zerbini. The Zerbini brothers were they're from Lesvos. The Zerbini brothers are very important in the economic life of Egypt, and they are one of the pioneers of manufacturing and Egyptian industry through the factories, the Kafr El Zayat cotton factory. It's not an exporting company. It's a factory that processes the cotton. It's cotton ginning. Another example is the Giannaklis Nestor Giannaklis, who was an old tobacco merchant. Giannaklis is also the pioneer of growing vine and producing wine in Egypt. And this slide I'm showing you shows us that the Giannaklis vineyards exist to today. Of course, they're part of the Egyptian government. They're not the Giannaklis ownership anymore. Giannaklis read ancient texts of Herodotus and found out references to wine being grown in antiquity. He brought agriculturalists over from Greece, and within 20 years, he produced wine on the banks of the Nile River, which was an extraordinary achievement and a huge additional contribution to Egypt. Finally, I spoke about the old hospital. I should talk about the new hospital. This was built in Alexandria in the 1930s. It's the time when it's obvious that the capitulations, taxation, protection, all those protections were going to go. And yet the Kotsika family invest in a modern hospital built. It was then in the outskirts of Alexandria. Now it's part of Alexandria, which was eventually turned over to the Egyptian government and remains to today one of the major medical facilities of the country, built at the time when it was absolutely certain that foreign privileges would go. And finally, on this particular segment, before I reach the final part of my slides, Stratis Tsirkas, the pseudonym of the writer Yannis Hadjiandreas, known for his books on Cavafy, in 1937 was living in Egypt and wrote poems which he called Ifelahi. The felah is, as you can see from the photograph, the name for the Egyptian peasant. None of the other foreign communities in Egypt would ever bother to write about Egyptian peasants. They were invisible to them. The Greeks, as I said, they were living in the small towns in the south of the country. They lived next to the Fellahim, as they're called, and Tsirkas devoted poems to them. That, for me, is yet another proof of a contribution to Egypt and the close ties and connection between the two countries. Finally, we have the Egyptian Revolution of 1952 under Gamal Abdel Nasser. This was the beginning of the end. The Greeks were not expelled, but what happened was there was a series of measures which was taken over a decade, which effectively squeezed the Greeks out of Egypt. It was a kind of stage by stage process, and most of the Greeks had left by the 1960s. But even after the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, we have Greek contributions. In 1956, we have the Suez Crisis. Nasser wanted to nationalize the canal, which was run by French and British interests. The canal was opened, as I said, in 1869, and the British and the French had not allowed Egypt to benefit from the canal which ran through its country. And Nasser, as part of his nationalist program, decided to nationalize the canal and faced an attack by the British, the French, and Israeli forces. Right at that time, the Greeks who were working in the canal, not only the pilots who were navigating, helping the ships navigate through the canal, but also all the administrative employees remained at their posts. It was at the request of the Greek government, but they voluntarily felt close enough to the Egyptians, and their role was crucial in keeping the canal running. And when the attack took place, we have Greeks in the canal area producing blankets and goods for the people. There was a few days of bombing, and people were destitute in the canal area. This is from a French magazine, Touchante Solidarité de Grecs d'Égypte, touching solidarity on the part of the Greeks of Egypt for the Egyptians. And as a recognition of the Greek attitude during the Suez Crisis of 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser supported Cyprus. As we know, Cyprus began its struggle for independence and union with Greece, independence from the British, union with Greece in 1955. Union was not achieved, independence was achieved. Nasser was on the side of Cyprus, and here we see him hosting Archbishop Makarios of Cyprus in 1962. Eventually, the Greeks left. This is a photograph of the launch of my book that took place in Cairo exactly a year ago. There are now just a few thousand Greeks left in Alexandria and in Cairo. They're prospering, but the community, which was once 150,000, is only a few thousand left. But I think the legacy of the contribution is one that still sustains the close ties of Greece and Egypt. And I thank you.
Thank you, Alexandros. I think you covered a big part of my questions, but I will go through them anyway.
Yes.
My first question is, what did it attract the Greeks to move to Egypt, especially to Egypt? When the immigration started, and were there areas of Greece that they were represented more in Egypt than other?
So, you know, throughout the 19th century, we have Greeks moving to other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean until we get to the 1890s and the current crisis in Peloponnesus, and then we have the transatlantic emigration when America becomes the destination. Before that, it was really the wealth of the cotton. What happened was, when the American Civil War took place in the 1860s, the cotton from the South wasn't being exported anymore. And at that time, the second best quality cotton was the Egyptian one. So Egypt was facing a bonanza, and thousands of Greeks moved to Egypt, attracted by the opportunities of cotton and everything else surrounding cotton. And as the example of my great-grandparents show, it was the Aegean Islands, which was very easy to go. Once upon a time, going north-south in the Aegean was very normal. And then people started leaving from Cyprus, from a Greek coastline, and then mainland Greece.
Yeah, I'm familiar with many Epirotan names. For example, Mezzovo Polytechnio is being built by the Greeks of Egypt from Epirus. So were the Epirotans also a big part of the Greeks there?
Absolutely, yes. And if I had not, for strategic purposes, focused on the Benakides, I would have mentioned Georgios Averof, who was from Mezzovo, who was the wealthiest person in Egypt in the late 19th century, and financed the Panathinaikos Stadio for the Olympic Games of 1896. He financed the refurbishing of the ancient stadium. And of course, in his will in 1899, he bequeathed a huge sum of money for Greece. And we have the building of the warship Averof, and the warship Averof, as we know, helps in fact, crucially helps Greece in the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913. So the Mezzovo merchants, Mezzovo is an extraordinary phenomenon in Greece because it's in the Pinedos Mountains. You would think, you know, it's isolated. It was not. It had emigration everywhere, including many, many successful Greeks in Egypt.
Thank you. Can you elaborate a little bit further on the interactions of the Greeks of Egypt with the local people? Because I have heard lots of stories that the Egyptians still, they remember the Greeks. And actually a few days, a friend of mine told me that when he was there last winter, the locals, they told him, if you say at the shops that you are Greek, you will get a better discount.
Yes. So I'll tell you a story. So last year, as I said, I was doing this book presentation in Cairo, and it was at the American University in Cairo. So I walk on the stage and I see that the participants were not only Greeks from Egypt, and some people did the honor of coming down from Alexandria, but half the audience were Egyptians, and many women were wearing. So, I said, okay, so now this is the test for me, because I'm going to talk about good relations. And I spoke about good relations, and people from the audience stood up and confirmed this, that in fact, because the Greeks were, first of all, we had a lot of lower class Greeks. I mentioned the grocers, barbers, small shop owners. The small shop owners in poor neighborhoods are going to be dealing with Egyptians. So even if they wanted to be snobby, they wouldn't. But this applies, I think, to all of the Greeks. I think it applies to the Greek diaspora, in my view. In other words, the British in Egypt, the French in Egypt, the Italians in Egypt, they were there psychologically. They thought, whatever happens to us here, we've got a big, powerful empire behind us. If we get into trouble, we'll get the support. Greece cannot do that. Greece is not an empire. It's a small country. You can't be sure. I think the Greek diplomatic corps is excellent, but it's not the diplomatic corps of a powerful empire. So I think the Greek abroad, and especially in Egypt, and dare I say it, in the United States, knows that they need to adapt, and they come into these countries with a different, more humane attitude to the locals.
Very good. Can you tell us a little bit more about the social and cultural life of the Greek communities in Egypt, and which of those they were the most vibrant? You mentioned Alexandria and Port Said. Were there other areas that they were vibrant Greek communities?
When I tell the story of the Greeks in Egypt, I'm always conscious that I'm going to be talking about Alexandria, but that's not fair. It's like talking about the Greeks in the United States and only talking about New York. And, sometimes New York Greek Americans can become a little bit too esoteric, but let me not go there. But the Alexandrian Greeks are a bit like that. No, the Greeks were everywhere. There was a very big Greek community in Cairo, in all the canal towns, because there was Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez. There were Greeks in the Nile Delta, in other words, in between Alexandria and Cairo, especially Mansoura. And all those communities had a range of social benefit institutions. They had their churches, they had their schools, they had their clubs. And I think the interesting thing with the social and cultural life was that the Greeks have their own Greek institutions, but they also interact with Egyptians, as we've said, and they interact with the other foreigners. It's an extremely vibrant community in that sense. Intellectually, as I said, Cavafy is the example, but many, many more were there. And there were sports clubs, there was the whole range of activity. It was a Greek microcosm in Egypt. It was quite spectacular.
You mentioned already some of the ties of the Greek communities in Egypt and Greece, and how the community there benefited Greece. Is anything else that you can add on this than what you mentioned in your slides?
I want to, since I mentioned Penelope Delta, I want to mention something she says in her diaries. She's written diaries which have come out in several volumes. So in the first volume, Πρώτες ενθυμήσεις, First Memories, she talks about growing up in Egypt. And she says that we were growing up in Egypt and we understood that the British were very important, but our family, our parents always taught us that we are Greek, that we always knew that we are Greek. And the Greeks in Egypt grew up in that sense. There was a very, very strong patriotic dimension. And there were volunteers who went back for the Balkan Wars, as they were from North America. And there was volunteers during World War II. There were contributions. A lot of philanthropic institutions were established. So, the Benakis and the Averov are the tip, but there are hundreds more of benefactors.
I suppose the Greeks, they had their schools, their libraries, and so on and so on. Were the Egyptians attending also these schools, participating in the life of the Greek community?
At first, no, but as the community opened up in the 1930s, when the privileges were going, you had some participation in the school, interactions in clubs, and the most important was that you had on boards of managers of companies, it was mandated by the law, you had Greeks and Egyptians sitting on the same board. So you had a very close collaboration.
The title of your lecture and also of your book alludes to contributions of the Greeks of Egypt to the making of modern Egypt. Is there anything additional to add from what you already covered?
You know, just to revisit what I said, in the scholarly world I inhabit, to come out with a contribution is much more conflictual and controversial than it is among the Greeks in Egypt. And that's why I had to make very sure that this was a contribution that was based on those ties I spoke about. You know, there's a kind of idea of a special relationship that the Greeks have. And I think that's unique to the Greeks in Egypt.
You mentioned the exodus of the Greeks and how it happened from Egypt, and there are some still remaining there. Are these remaining communities have some kind of distinction still, or they just absorbed with the local people?
That's an interesting, first of all, we have a change in the demography. There are more Greeks in Cairo now than there are in Alexandria, because Cairo is the Egyptian center and the economic center. And the Greeks of Cairo, from what I understood and as I saw them, still retain their Greek identity, but they all can speak Arabic and they're kind of bicultural, I would say. Less so the Greeks of Alexandria. But, you know, I think they feel very comfortable and very secure in the country. The last person from my family to leave was my grandfather in the early 60s. My grandfather didn't want to go. My father was already in Athens and he was telling him, you know, your company's been nationalized. You've got to come back. You've got to come to Greece. And my grandfather felt so comfortable, even in an Egypt with a nationalist government. And, you know, this sentiment has continued. That's why we still have, I don't know, there's about 6,000 maybe maximum still there.
You mentioned that Nasser, he supported Cyprus. Can we say that the history of the Greeks in Egypt still creates some special ties between Greece and Egypt? Greece and Egypt recently, they signed an agreement about their exclusive economic zones, and both they face the belligerency of Turkey. Can we say that the history somehow helps in the development of some special tie between Greece and Egypt, even today?
Even today, I think, especially because the legacy is still Nasser in Egypt, the ties of the two countries, we had the recent diplomatic agreements, but for me, they stem very naturally from a long history of close relationship. And I was very pleased to see these, because I think Greece and Egypt are natural ties. They're two countries that have very common history, common present, common interest in the Eastern Mediterranean. They're natural allies.
Very good. Thank you very much. And now we are going to open it to the questions of the attendees. Please type your questions.
Also, there are 19 questions already. Please go to the Q&A.
Yes.
There are 19 questions.
I see them. Shall I start?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So as I said, I was, where was I born and how old was I when I left? I was born in Athens. I was the first to be born in Greece. But I luckily, because I was doing my research for my dissertation, although I mentioned my grandfather was the last to leave, I had my grandmother's sister was still in Egypt. So I spent 6 months in the 1980s living with her in Alexandria, meeting the Greeks who were still there. So I felt I was able to get some kind of sense of what it was like living there. The current status of the Greek community in Egypt, they are both, they have dual citizenship in most cases, is Costa de la Yorgas's question. And as I said, they are comfortable and secure. Next question, surprised that the wine was allowed and still exists in a Muslim country like Egypt, or perhaps it was by British permission since they were not independent. Look, the Muslim political party, which is known as the Muslim Brotherhood, was created in the 1920s, but was a small force in Egyptian politics. And in 1952, the revolution was very nationalist and I'd say quite secular. Islamic politics are a very recent phenomenon in Egypt. I'm speaking as a historian, recent, okay, so that's a decade long, a little bit more maybe. And as we know, the Muslim president was a short-lived phenomenon in Egypt. So to that extent, Egypt is quite obviously a Muslim country, and much more so than it was in the past. But I don't know, maybe it's part of being part of the Mediterranean culture. The wine is still there and still sold. Presentation, thank you. The subject of the diaspora takes on many facets, each of them a source of knowledge, inspiration. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. The book, Nick, can be bought on Amazon. I think the publisher also has their page, but Amazon, for better or for worse, Amazon is where we can get the books cheaper. And apologies to any of you who might be bookstore owners, but this is the reality of our times. What role did the Greeks from Northern Epirus play in Egypt? As a footnote, my grandfather, a graduate of Chalki, was offered a position of head priest at the Cathedral of Alexandria in the early 20s. And came to Boston. How wonderful. This is the Greek diaspora. You have a choice of Alexandria or Boston. Yes, the Northern Epirotes were a significant part of they are mixed actually, the Epirotes, because many of them emigrated before the creation of Albania, right after the Balkan Wars. They were all called Epirotes. There were also Vlachs mentioned in them. And they basically were, because they were from the early emigration, they were very important in the cotton sector, exporting, because the Epirotes are merchants by I'd almost say by culture, and they were very important in the cotton sector. Can I describe the role of the Greeks in the Egyptian cotton industry beyond developing a new strain of cotton? Were Greeks present in the fields as workers, landowners, or only involved in aspects related to trade? Not as workers as such. The workers was this huge agrarian class, the Egyptian fellahim. The Greeks were agents of cotton companies. So in other words, you had the big cotton exporting companies based in Alexandria, but they sent agents to go and buy cotton in the small towns and out in the fields in the Nile Delta. They were the agronomists as well. They were the grocers. lent money to the fellahin, initially at quite usurious rates, we have to say. Not everything was benign, but eventually with the creation of banks, there were Greek banks involved. So the Greek presence was, I would say, throughout the cotton business, aside from actually working in the fields. What was life like for a Greek family living in a small town in Upper Egypt? Might this grocery store owning family be the only Greeks in the area? Rarely, I think in most towns, there was a Greek entity, but the further south you went, the fewer Greeks there were. And there's a wonderful description by Lord Cromer. Lord Cromer is the British commissioner who's in charge of Egypt in the early 20th century. And the British are sending troops down the south to take over Sudan. And there's a wonderful story that Cromer says, we arrive in a small Egyptian town, and there's a Greek grocer already selling stuff there. Because what the Greeks did was they followed the British troops selling stuff for them, and in many cases arrived in the towns before the British did. And yes, you had the only Greeks in the area. And that's, I think that's what politis means, skapanis του πολιτισμού, pioneers of civilization. Not that civilization would not have happened without the Greeks. The Egyptians would have done that, or the other foreigners would have done that, but the Greeks were so adventurous in helping the country's development. What was the effect of the Egyptian economy that the removal of the Greeks had? Yes, well, coincidentally, what happened was that the value of cotton was dropping in the 1950s anyway, and the Greeks had to, and Egypt had to adapt economically and diversify its economy. But there was a great deal of know-how that was lost. I spoke about the cotton ginning, the manufacturing. When I was doing my research, I spoke to a gentleman called Simeon Pialopoulos, who had a textile factory in Egypt. And literally in the 1960s, when they had nationalizations, he went to work in the morning, and there was an army unit in front of the gate and told him, this is not your business anymore. And there was a loss, I think, of productivity, significant because of a loss of know-how. I think that loss, that lag, was maybe less because the Greeks already had Egyptian business partners and were imparting a know-how, but it was certainly something that noticeable, the absence of the Greeks. John, what are the Greeks in Egypt do now? They are merchants. They're especially got, they've got import-export there. They've got car dealerships. They are the ones, because of their language skills, the Greeks in Egypt play the role of in import-export, no longer of cotton, which was nationalized, but of consumer goods primarily. Did I come across any mention of the French composer Sans? Doesn't come to mind at the moment. Savas, how were the Greeks viewed by the Egyptians? Was any envy due to the financial success? The Egyptian nationalism, which eventually became a government in 1952, started in 1919. They had the first uprisings of the Egyptian nationalists. And what was very interesting was that the Egyptian nationalists did a kind of triage. They said, who is the main enemy here? The foreigners or the British? The British, because the British controlled the country. And The uprisings of 1919 and of 1921 were anti-British, and the Egyptian nationalists were not turning against the Greeks. And it sounds almost as if I'm sugarcoating things, but it's true that there's an uprising in 1919. There's a loss of life and Greek property as well, but the Greek consul comes out, Sachtouris comes out in solidarity with the Egyptians, and the Egyptian nationalists appreciated that. It was an issue of, what's the main problem in this country? It's the British. Focus on them. I also mentioned close historic, cultural, and geographic ties between the Greeks and the Egyptians. Was there ever a large Greek population in Egypt before the 19th century migration, other than Ptolemaic Egypt? So there are some people who actually talk about a continuous presence. They say one of our special relations, we were there in antiquity. Our patriarchate was there. St. Mark the Evangelist established the patriarchate. We had a continuous presence. Doesn't quite come out with a historical data. In fact, the patriarch many times had to go to Constantinople because of the difficult situation in Egypt. What is true, of course, is that maybe some Egyptians of the present were have some quote unquote Greek DNA with them, but no, after Ptolemaic Egypt, the Greek presence decreased significantly. Greek-Egyptian intermarriage, and was there any measurable turn into Islam as a result? No, there's very little. There were some cases in the 19th century of some isolated instances of Greek women being forcefully brought over to Egypt by the Ottomans, but otherwise there wasn't a great deal of intermarriage. The Greeks significantly, and this speaks to the sense and the cohesion of the community, the Greeks married Greeks, and it has to do with the fact that you have such a gigantic presence of Greeks there. So the intermarriage, the rates of intermarriage are very small in terms of both Egyptians and even British, Italians, etc. Small intermarriage rates. Could you elaborate on the reasons of exodus of the Greeks? Were these political reasons, Greeks supporting Farouk before Nasser's the revolution, or was it the nationalist movement? How long can I have to answer that question? We had a wonderful conference about a decade ago in Athens on the Exodus, and there are so many reasons, and there are so many versions. So the short answer is, first of all, there are several points. First of all, there was no expulsion. They're not expelled. There is an expulsion of foreigners. After the Suez Crisis of 1956 and the British attack, the French attack, the Israeli attack, British, French, and French and foreign Jews are kicked out of the country. They're literally told to leave within a week. That never happens with the Greeks. But Greek properties, but the Greeks, there's an increase of taxation. They're forced to take partners. This is in the 1950s. And eventually their businesses, the big businesses at least, are nationalism. There was a sense of unease. I've asked people, I had one of my uncles left, he had studied in Cairo at the Abetios school, which was an excellent high school. And he went to England because there were no opportunities in Egypt. So the 1950s, there was a concern about how far the nationalists would reach and a concern that they didn't have a future in the country. So the young generation left, and many of them went to Australia. There was a big movement towards Australia, but also to North America as well. If we kind of just say, 1952 and then nationalizations of 1962, 63, the more we go along this decade, the more it's a forcible emigration. The early immigrants especially before Suez, the only thing they're saying is, hey, there are no opportunities here. I'm going to emigrate. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Thank you for everyone. I don't know if there are any other questions. I think I've answered the questions I see. I don't know if there are any other questions.
I see some. Do you want me to read them to you?
Yes.
Okay, there is one says, you may have discussed the risks on the bilateral Greek-Egyptian relations.
Yeah. Costa, I see it. I
okay.
clicked down, I see it. Thank you.
Okay.
Wait, now I said that. You may have discussed the risks on the bilateral Greek-Egyptian relations from Turkey. How do you account for them moving forward? My mentor, Professor Vrionis, the Byzantinist, whenever he was asked this question, said, "You're asking a historian about the future, not a good person to answer." But I think the Greek-Egyptian relations, as I indicated, because they stem naturally from the affinities of the two countries, are here to stay. How that will relate to the developments in Turkey, remains to be seen. I did not want to mention the source of my interest in the diaspora. My family's surname George can be traced back to 1795 in Wales. The mystery, however, is that 95% of the people in Wales with the surname George have their ancestry in Greece. So the question I am trying to pursue is when they emigrated from Chios to Wales and why that happened. George, can George join me? My family is from Chios. We have this Russian ending, Kitroeff. I found out that the father of my great-grandfather, the great-grandfather emigrated. His father was the dragoman, the official translator of the Ottoman governor of Chios. I found that in the Smyrna newspaper of 1874. But, we don't know exactly what happened, why they got a Russian name, and why exactly they wanted to leave from Chios. I know that there are a lot of Chiotes ship owners. I think maybe you and I are the descendants of Chiotes who were not ship owners. That's all I can speculate. Elaine Thomopoulos, hi. How did the Greeks of Egypt fare when they returned to Greece after Nasser came to power? Very well. They fared very well because they were cosmopolitan and they knew a lot of languages and were able to hire, to find jobs in Greek companies. There is a wonderful passage in Theodore Salutos' book. Theodore Salutos, the historian of Greek America, has written a book about return migration. They remember America. It's about the Greeks who went back to Greece. And he writes that in the 1950s, the Greeks who came back were not received as well by the Greeks of Greece, in contrast with the Greeks of Egypt, because the Greeks of Egypt had this bourgeois way of doing things and new languages and were cosmopolitan. And of course, as we know, the Greeks in America were Amerikanakia from the Greek provinces. So, especially the Athenian Greeks, they don't really relate to that. So the Greek Egyptians were easier to relate to, and they took on important positions. They, at some point, and I didn't keep that clipping, but it's in the Vima newspaper. In the 1980s, they had the statistic that 17% of the staff of the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs were Greeks from Egypt. That kind of shows you how well they did. Anastasios Muhammad Ali, who was from Kavala and became governor of Egypt, is credited for encouraging Greeks to migrate to Egypt and help it with its commerce. Do I agree? Yes, of course I agree. Muhammad Ali was an Albanian trader in Kavala, and he actually met Mezzovo Greeks there, the Tositsas. And when he went down to Egypt as a mercenary and eventually became the Khedive, the governor of Egypt, he invited, and he wanted to embark on a process of modernization. His automatic reaction was to invite the Greek merchants that he had met in Kavala. And in a sense, that's how the Greek presence started. As a footnote, and this'll, I mean, it's a big discussion, but you know, Muhammad Ali is forced by the Ottomans to send his son Ibrahim to Peloponnesos during the 1821 revolution. And as we know, the Greek revolution almost was reversed completely because of the force of Ibrahim's troops that also landed on Crete and Kassos. Eventually, though, we had the Battle of Navarino and sunk the Egyptian fleet. Amazingly, throughout this process, Muhammad Ali is dealing with Tositsas and the other Greek merchants in Alexandria, business as usual. And after the great powers sink his fleet, he kind of writes it off as a kind of problem he had because the Ottomans forced him to do it, and continues to invite Greeks from Egypt. It's an extraordinary story. I'm clicking down. Thank you. Greetings to Kehila Kedosha Synagogue. It was so wonderful to be there. Gosh, it was February. All my book presentations before the pandemic seem as if they're kind of part of a prehistoric age. And I found more information about the Greek Jews in Egypt, and I'll be sharing it, hopefully. Another footnote, I love footnotes. Mother's father, who was born in Andros and lived in Athens, had an operatic voice and could break crystal with it. He ran off to Alexandria to join the opera, and his father ran after him and brought him back. Yes, these are lovely stories because, you know, from an academic point of view, you've got to give the causes of emigration, which are economic or political, etc. And of course, as we know, a lot of people emigrate or re-emigrate or go back to their homeland for completely idiosyncratic personal reasons. And that's always good to know. Oh, another, what can history teach us about the future of Greeks in the United States? You know, as a historian, I don't know anything about the future, but the Greeks in the United States are so close to my daily being. I think the history is one of adaptation. I think it's the characteristic of the Greek in the diaspora that the Greek adapts, and that means two things. I think the Greek adapts, therefore they survive, but to a certain extent, they will combine their ethnicity with another type of identity. But I think the Greekness can and will remain for a couple more generations. Again, to refer to Professor Briones, he used to sometimes say, you know, sometimes our issue with language is a bit too much because our kids, our grandkids, they won't learn the language. But if we teach them the Greek culture and the Greek heritage that we can be proud of, then they will identify as Greek, and many may actually go and learn the Greek language. So you know, I think, again, to make a specific Greek case, I think the Greeks have the type of heritage that might enable them to hang on to that heritage more than many other ethnic groups in America. Greek churches now in Alexandria, yes, the Evangelismos, the cathedral that was built in the 1850s with Tositsa's money, is still standing and functioning, and the offices of the Patriarchate are there next to the cathedral. It was the old Averov school, which has become now part of the Patriarchate. So we still have churches in fully functioning churches in Alexandria and in Cairo. The Greek schools, to go to the next question, they are still operating, but you know, back in the 1920s, the Greek schools in Egypt were on a par with the Greek schools in Greece. They were of an extremely high educational standards. The Averov school in Alexandria, the Abetios school in Cairo. And you know, that was the same in Smyrna before 1922. The Smyrna schools were on a par with the Athenian schools. They are still, and there was a range of schools. There were community schools, there were private schools. There was a range of schools in not only in Alexandria and in Cairo, but also the smaller towns. Mansoura had a very important school, which was also a boarding school for children from the general area. We still have a school left in Cairo and Alexandria. The numbers are decreasing slowly, but the schools are still functioning. The Greek community in Alexandria, particularly in the 1940s, 1950s, was frequently a destination for successful Greek singers and actors and actresses for concerts and theater. And yes, you could write a whole study of that. It was so easy for them, of course, to get on the ship in Piraeus and go south to Alexandria and tour Egypt. And it was singers, there was actors, opera singers, concerts and theater were a very frequent phenomenon in Egypt, right through to the 1950s. What about the Greek community vis-a-vis the Jewish community? Very close relations beginning in the 1920s, especially when the issue of nationalism was on the horizon. The cosmopolitan life of Alexandria was one which brought the Greeks and the Jews together very closely, both with commerce and industry, but also in many, many social clubs as well. You see the boards of social clubs and societies. Something called the Sporting Club of Alexandria was the sporting club, and you see this very close Greek-Jewish interaction at the time, because both those communities were very cosmopolitan. A small question, I mentioned that of the less than 6,000 Greeks remaining in Egypt, many of them speak Arabic and are bicultural. Do they speak Greek generally? Here in the USA, my general understanding is that the percentage of Americans of Greek descent who speak Greek is substantially declining. Yes, it's substantially declining, and there's some statistics one can look up. The American census of the US Census of 2000 for the United States. I think there's 1.6 million who say they've got some Greek heritage. And then for the question, do you speak Greek at home? There's about, I think it's 600,000 people say that. So that gives you, and when we say speak Greek at home, you know, I don't know what speaking Greek at home really means. But in Egypt, Egypt is much less of an assimilative society. You know, here in America, you're allowed your ethnicity, but you are very much expected to Americanize. Not so in Egypt, because again, like a Mediterranean country, it's been very used to having many foreigners coming through the country. So you can, they all speak, you know, very, very good Greek. There's no loss of Greek among the Greeks in Egypt. So the first Greek settle in Egypt in modern times, I think Muhammad Ali takes power in 1805, and within a few years, Tositsas arrives. And then by 1854, we have the creation of the Greek community of Alexandria, Hellenic Kinotis Alexandrias. So I think it's the first half of the 19th century. By the mid 19th century, we are talking about communities, schools, both in Alexandria, community organizations, schools, hospitals, both in Cairo and Alexandria. Before Muhammad Ali, I mean, there are a few numbers of Greeks. You know, there's an instance in which Napoleon goes to Egypt from 1799 to 1801. There are a few Greeks there. Because of the maritime contact between the two countries, there was always a small Greek maritime presence that came and left in Alexandria. Were there any Greek families that trace their ancestry to the Byzantine period? No, you know, I haven't heard that from the part of the Greeks in Egypt. There's not as much of an interest or concern about genealogy, but looking at the Byzantine presence, where there was a Greek element, surely, but no one has really studied that. Tasso, thank you. George Economidis, my mother's father's dream was manifested through my mother. She went to the Athens Conservatory of Music and she had his voice. My father, who also went to Chalki and the University of Athens, would sing a duet during the Divine Liturgy. She took the role of the Psalti since we didn't have one. But parishioners would come to church and commented that my listening to them was like going to the opera. My father was forward-thinking and a classmate of Iakovos at Chalki. Indeed, thank you for that. Has anyone cataloged the Greek contemporary libraries in Egypt? Yes. What happened was there was a Greek from Egypt called Dimitris Charitatos. Dimitri left in the 1960s. Because of his good knowledge of English and French, he got a job at, there's a company called Pechine, Aluminio tis Eladas, the aluminum factory, you know, near Delphi. And Dimitri was very important there. Dimitri was a collector of books because, you know, there were hundreds of books published in Egypt, you know, by Greek printers and publishing houses. And Dimitri was a collector, and his son Manos Charitatos also had the bug of being a collector, and they collected all the books. They brought them over from Egypt. Manos had them in an apartment in Pagrati when I was doing my doctoral research in the 1980s. Manos took me into one apartment. It was full of shelves and shelves of books on all topics published in Greek in Egypt. And eventually, I think it was under Melina Mercouri, being culture minister in the 1980s, the Charitatos collection became the Ελληνικό Λογοτεχνικό Ιστορικό Αρχείο, the Hellenic Literary Historical Archive. They were given a building in Plaka, and now they have two buildings, and it's like a mini archive of books from Egypt, newspapers, magazines, and everything that was published from in Egypt. this is not our topic, but it's my dream to start a Greek American library in Athens as well. I've got a lot of Greek American books, and the Charitatos collection doesn't have Greek American books. And one day I dream of doing what Charitatos did for the Greeks in Egypt, doing that for the Greeks of America in Athens. But that's that's another story. I believe it's Angelo is the next question. What do I think?
Yeah, George, this is fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes. George is laughing. Angelo, what do I think about the poet Constantine Cavafy? Litsa. You know, it's very difficult because you noticed I mentioned Cavafy twice, because if you dwell on Cavafy, Cavafy is so huge. He's an international personality. He's going to obliterate everyone else. You could just have one lecture on Cavafy. And when I mean Cavafy, not just Cavafy himself, but Cavafy's Alexandria, about his circle, his friends, the magazines that were there, which he published. And Cavafy was very careful. There were two competing literary magazines, very important literary magazines, Gramata and Nea Zoe. Soon as Cavafy published, let's say Gramata published a poem by Cavafy, oops, he said, okay, I'd better send one to Nea Zoe as well. So, he was very much, he's extremely cosmopolitan and an international stature, but he was very much part of the Greek scene in Egypt. And so when I think of Cavafy, I think of a Greek in Egypt. And, his apartment is a museum now, thanks to the initiative of a number of funders. When I was in Egypt in the 1980s, living with my grandmother's sister, the house wasn't a museum. It was like a pension, and I actually had to give someone a tip so that they take me up to the first floor, second floor American style, right up the stairs, to see Cavafy's apartment, which was full of beds. So when I think of Cavafy, I think of Greeks in Egypt first of all, and that community sustaining and producing his brilliance.
How do the Egyptians view Cavafy today?
They take Cavafy very seriously. They've been Arabic translations. They've been a number of conferences, and there is a great debate. And, I think the Egyptians, and rightly so, they take credit as well. They believe that Cavafy belongs to them. And, of course it does. Yes, the Greek Orthodox Church in America. It has been reported that 90% of Greek ancestry have left the church. George Kakazis. Am I supposed to comment on the 90%? Shall we start a conversation on this? What has happened to the Greek churches in Egypt? They've stayed in Egypt. It's being, being in a, the alternative is to go, you're not going to convert to Islam. And, conversion to the Coptic church wasn't viable. And the Catholic and Protestant churches were not attractive. So in many ways, the Greek Orthodox presence in Egypt remains very intact, maybe part of a cosmopolitanism, in the sense that the religious, and we haven't spoken a lot about this, it's almost another topic, the religious landscape in Egypt accommodates a lot of churches. So it's completely different from the United States, where you've got an Anglo influence, dare I say it, a dominant Protestant church. That's not so much the case in Egypt. It's more accommodating. Next by George, the Greeks were squeezed out of Egypt and also from Turkey with Erdogan's Islamism and nationalism and the conversion of Hagia Sophia and other Orthodox churches into mosques. Do you foresee the possible expulsion of the Patriarchate and relocation to the US? If the Patriarchate of Antioch can move to Damascus, can the Patriarchate of Constantinople be moved to Washington, D.C.? Wow, nice.
Hopefully not.
I'll answer as a historian. And the historian's answer is always, to predict the future, we look at the patterns of the past. The patterns of the past is that the Patriarchate has survived so many centuries in Constantinople. Turkey, if we look at Turkey's history since 1922, it's gone through various phases. Arguably, for the last 2 decades, it's gone through one of the most aggressive nationalist phases, and it's a threat to the presence of the Greeks and the Greek Orthodox. But, you know, we're talking about a centuries-old presence. You know, let's wait another decade before we answer that question, or wait another decade to see how we could answer that question.
Very good. It seems that we have exhausted all the questions. Stefanos told me that there are no questions from Facebook. Is that correct?
Let me, I just found one.
Okay. Can you?
It's just a statement.